Hey YouTube, sitting down on my backpack. It's David, the Georgia photographer, and we're in Charlotte, North Carolina today. And today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Forgot to take you guys with me, didn't I? What I want to do today is talk about aperture and the several things that it affects in an image. This is going to be sort of my little tutorial series, and I'm still kind of focused on the budget camera equipment deal. I have another piece of that coming up that I ran into a small hiccup on, but we're getting there. I've about resolved that problem and moved forward too. What I want to do today is discuss how aperture affects the image, and there's 4 different things that aperture does to an image. One, aperture controls how much light's coming into the camera. So if you want a faster shutter speed, you go to a larger aperture, which is a lower F number. All right. So if you want less light coming into the camera, say you're out in the broad daylight, out in a really sunny environment, and you want like a slower shutter speed, say you want a blurry water or a blurry car going by for some kind of urban scene, you run your f-stop up real high to like a f22 or something, and that chokes off the light coming into the camera, so the camera sees that reduction in light. If you're running aperture priority, it'll do the math for you, and it'll slow down your shutter speed. So it's a kind of a way of adding a ND filter without adding an ND filter. We'll get into the benefit of an actual ND filter in a different video. Suffice it to say, you can regulate the amount of light. That's one thing it does. Another thing aperture does is it allows for artistic effects. A typical 7-bladed Nikon aperture will create the effect of stars with the aperture closed way down and a bright light source shining into the lens. Sun stars are really interesting, can add awesome effects. You see it a lot of times on Christmas lights, things like that. So there's always that option too. Let's go downstairs now. Another thing aperture does, it controls the depth of field. Okay, depth of field is kind of an analogous term. If you break it down, what it says is how much of the image appears to be in focus. There's only one thin plane of actual focus, but to the human being, it looks like there's more in focus than there really is. With the aperture, you can control how much of the image appears to be in focus. So what that's going to say is, like if you have a f2.8 lens and you shoot it at f2.8, the depth of apparent focus is going to be real shallow, closer to the camera. It's a ratio. So if your subject is, say, 100 meters away, the depth of focus, or the depth of field, as you hear it spoken, is going to be proportionate to the distance from the camera. Let's say whatever you're photographing is 100 meters away and you shoot it at f2.8. The depth of field is going to appear to be, 50 meters wide. These are just made up numbers. I don't have an actual depth of field chart with me, so. But let's say you shoot that same subject 50 centimeters away, well, now your depth of field is only going to be this much. So it's a lot shallower depth of field, so the things behind the subject are going to be blurrier really, really soon. I have someone here. Let's see. I think he's on the phone, but the whole point of the depth of field is that you can control how much of the background is blurry depending on how close you are to the subject and what aperture you're at. So if you close down your aperture, it deepens the depth of field so that even up close, you won't have much light, but your depth of field will be much deeper. So your apparent subject matter that's in focus will be greater. And so that's why you see landscape photographers shoot at like f8 or f11. Number one, they're shooting at something typically far away. And number two, that increases the amount of stuff that apparently is in focus and frame for them. So it makes the whole scene to look like the whole thing's in focus. It's getting a little colder the longer I'm out here. All right. The next thing that Aperture lets you do is it lets you work with the ISO in your camera to get the desired effect on your image. What it's going to do is, I wonder if this noise from these cars is going to be causing that bigger problem. Didn't really think that through when I decided to use this location. But yeah, they'll stop in a minute. The ISO determines grain structure in your photos, you know, just like the old days with the silver halide crystals on film. So if you want an old photo look, man, the wind's really starting to blow, then you use a higher ISO. Higher ISO allows faster shutter speeds. You know, it's the whole exposure triangle. They all work together. The lower you can get your ISO, the crisper the image. And if you can open your shutter up, that allows more light in, which also thereby allows you to lower your ISO by default. Now it's going to give you a blurrier background, you know, so you can see where this is going. You know, they all kind of work together. But if you want less noise in your images, then you use a larger ISO. And there's a lot of cars here. I'm going to move. It's interesting how the railroad bed is a good 20 or so, 25 feet below the road. How they've run it basically under the town instead of above it. That's just neat. This is right outside of our hotel. We're staying at the Embassy Suites. But literally this is in the front yard. So I almost climbed down to the bridge to go get some photos of that graffiti. It's kind of hard to see it with the GoPro, but there's some pretty cool graffiti on the other side of the bridge. But I talked myself out of it, decided it probably wasn't worth it. So the whole train, and the train came through last night. This is an active rail. The whole idea is that they ran the train under the town. You can't even see it from the roads when you're driving around. That's just kind of, that's just really interesting. Another thing that Aperture does give you is artistic control of the image. With Aperture, you're able to choose how much of the background's blurry, what objects are not blurry, so you can draw attention to your subject that you want. It gives you control over how the viewer interacts with the image when you're finished. True to form, I forgot to film the outro again. Anyway, I don't know why I can't seem to do that. Probably because I didn't write out my shot list that day. Whatever. Aperture is a very powerful tool. It's a matter of fact, to me, it's the most interactive part of the camera system. You know, I can guide the viewer to see what I want them to see in the photograph. Does that make sense? It controls depth of field in relation to distance to your subject. It controls how much light comes into the camera. A larger aperture will have a faster shutter speed. A smaller aperture will typically require a slower shutter speed. You know, and these basics, once you get those basics down and kind of under your belt, then the world of photography suddenly just expands dramatically, much larger than it did before. Get out your camera, turn it off of program mode, or the little symbol for the green camera on Nikon, I believe it is, you know, where it's the automatic. Get out of automatic, put it in A, that's aperture priority. It's AV, I think, on Canon. That way you can actually have some control over what the image looks like and start experimenting with it. Take pictures of your cats like I do. You know, get out and shoot some photos. Figure out how your camera works. Figure out what's going on, what's making it do this or that, and then just enjoy the whole process of photography. That's the point. That's the reason we do it, is because we enjoy the process. So with that, I'm David, the Georgia photographer, and I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye-bye.